There's an alternate universe out there where I have a YouTube channel where I'm waxing poetic about the nu metal craze of the late 90s and early 2000s. Seriously, I once went to school dressed as Fred Durst. I had the whole deal. The Yankees cap, drawn-on goatee, shell tops, the whole thing was very awesome. But ultimately, I soon found punk and pop punk, and the rest, as they say, it's history. Look, I enjoy making jokes at the expense of nu metal, but I also appreciate the genre. And if you examine things closely, you find that nu metal and pop punk really are kindred spirits. They both rose to mainstream viability about around the same time, and they're both subgenres that were shunned by the gatekeepers of their parent genres. They also both had a moderate influence on culture and fashion. And once they went out of fashion, people really tried to distance themselves from them.
I don't want to be cool anymore.
I actually got the inspiration for this video by pouring through an issue of alternative press from about early 2001. It really amazed me that nu metal was dominating the coverage and pop punk or punk in general was clearly a second or even a third banana. And right now I'm going through these issues chronologically, so at some point I'll actually have a better sense of when that actually changed according to at least one publication. Initially, I wanted to analyze whether or not pop punk was responsible for the decline in nu metal. But after thinking that over, I found that really these genres, they're different sides of a similar coin. So I decided to do a little compare and contrast of pop punk and nu metal. And just for some clarity here, I think we can all agree on what I'm talking about when I refer to nu metal. But pop punk is a little more difficult. Obviously, the genre has existed since the inception of punk, and it's continued in several forms to this day. But for the sake of this video though, I'll be referring to the flavor of pop punk that was popular from about 94 to 05, 06-ish. Can we agree on that?
Why can't we all just get along?
So let's do it. Let's compare and contrast pop punk and nu metal. Who had the bigger stars? Both pop punk and nu metal produced mainstream celebrities. Popular music has always created celebrities, but punk and metal generally find it a little more difficult to find individual mainstream recognition. On the nu metal side, there was clearly a leader of the pack. It seems wild now, but at one point in time, Fred Durst was not just one of the biggest stars in music, but he was also just a massive star within pop culture. Look, Limp Bizkit sold a bazillion records. Somebody bought those albums. I know I did. And I'm guessing you did too.
I know what you did. What did I do? You know what you did.
But depending on what is considered nu metal, there's a pretty big dip in stardom after Durst. I mean, Kid Rock dabbled in nu metal, so he kind of fits here. And guys like Corey Taylor and Chester Bennington eventually became massive stars, but maybe not within the scope of nu metal. In fact, there may have even been a bit of a rejection of nu metal on their parts. I mean, it's been almost 2 decades since this style of pop punk was socially relevant, and some of the principal players, they're still viable stars. To this day, Mark, Tom, and Travis are still tabloid fodder. Not to mention that certain members of Fall Out Boy and Paramore have never really faded from the spotlight. And trust me, kids, it was much bigger back in the heyday of pop punk. You know, back when teen magazines were a thing, you could almost guarantee that the Madden twins would be featured on the corner of the cover. Additionally, these pop punkers were a natural fit on MTV. Not only was their music constantly playing in the background of whatever reality show they were pumping out at the time, but the members were featured alongside other pop stars of the day. Now let me be clear, all of these things did apply to the stars of nu metal. It's just the scale was much larger, it felt like, for pop punk stars. And it kind of makes sense. Pop punk was relatively inoffensive when it's juxtaposed to nu metal. Fair or unfair, nu metal had to wear the scarlet letter of Woodstock 99 and the Big Day Out Festival. And let me be clear, it's unfair to blame a genre of music for these tragedies. But those were kind of the breaks at the time. Also, people don't talk about it much anymore, but in the late 90s, there was a small revival of the moral panics of the 1980s. And nu metal was mainstream metal at the time, so negative attention really hurt the reputation of the genre.
Angry, heavy metal subculture.
On the other hand, pop punk was actually able to escape the reputation of its parent genre. The typical suburban mom probably had no idea that their kids were listening to a genre that was a derivative of a genre that produced guys like Johnny Rotten or G.G. Allin. What genre had more creativity? Look, pop punk was not as one-dimensional as some of its critics claim, but it really can't compete in the creativity department with nu metal. In a strange, twisted way, pop punk was a return to a simpler time. As I mentioned in past videos, pop punk was actually a throwback to the basics of punk rock. The only difference was that it was being accepted on a mass scale. Beyond that, pop punk also sounded like a descendant of the most successful pop acts of prior decades. Like their punk forefathers, pop punkers were always doing their best to do some sort of Beatles impression. And that's all well and good, but you can argue that it's inherently limiting. It feels like pop punk didn't evolve creatively until after the popularity of the genre began to wane. In fact, there might be a little bit of a correlation there. Conversely, nu metal was making it all up on the fly. Decades later, we have a pretty good conception of what constitutes nu metal, but at the time, anything nu metal did was, well, nu metal.
Thanks, Captain Obvious.
I don't think we thought about it as much at the time, but in a lot of ways, nu metal was a rejection of traditional heavy metal. Nu metal was the first genre of popular music that felt like it was the product of watching too much MTV. Today, it's common for an artist to be all over the place, but back in the 90s, things were much more segmented. Nu metal was a fusion of the musical genres that preceded it. The fact that nu metal could encompass everything from Crazy Town to Slipknot tells you everything you need to know about the spectrum of the genre. Nu metal blended components of other genres and created a unique sound all its own. And again, let me be clear, that's not a judgment on the quality, it's really a judgment on the creativity. For me, I'll always choose pop punk over nu metal, but this one's really not close in terms of creativity. Which subgenre was more relevant to the parent genre? It's more than fair to say that nu metal and pop punk were not embraced by the artists and the gatekeepers of their parent genres.
There are 10 reasons on why nu metal is the worst thing that humanity has ever made, and this video will show you all of them.
Both pop punk and nu metal have been branded as perversions of a more pure artistic endeavor. But let's face it, those who didn't share in the riches of the sudden popularity of each one of these genres had a little bit of an axe to grind. It's not a stretch to assume that a lot of the hate coming at nu metal and pop punk from the elder statesmen were really rooted in basic jealousy. And I'm sure there was a lot of jealousy aimed at these bands, but I don't think that tells the whole story. I think it was bigger. There were philosophical differences that created a schism. But even those differences themselves, they're different between the two subgenres. On the pop punk side of things, the issue was the very notion of the existence of pop punk. Depending on when you read an updated PDF of the punk rock rulebook, receiving any attention for your music is considered antithetical to the mission of punk. But the hate for pop punk went beyond that. The argument was actually less about punk rockers gaining fame and success off their music. In fact, the issue at hand was that popular music was exploiting the appeal of punk rock and profiting accordingly. It wasn't always true, but there's always been this sense that the pop punk superstars didn't pay the requisite dues and thus were undeserving of their status. On the metal side of things, I think it's much more about the substance of the music. Let's face it, the pursuit of fame and fortune is much less complicated in metal discourse. But as I mentioned earlier, in a weird way, nu metal was a bit of a rebellion toward the metal establishment. Nu metal did so many things that were not traditionally associated with heavy metal. Lyrically, nu metal was a little more introspective. Korn and Papa Roach were not singing about fighting demons and dragons. Their guitars took on a different role. Nu metal was less reliant on the big solos. Instead, the guitar and bass often served as another percussive instrument. And of course, most of all, nu metal blatantly fused hip-hop and funk into metal. Now, they weren't the first to combine the two, but they were really the first to reach this level of popularity. Okay, I've talked a lot, but who gets the nod here? Well, I feel like over time, there's been a thawing of the icy relationship between pop punk and, quote, real punk. Yes, there's still tensions and divisions, but it feels like some of that other stuff was overblown, or media hype, fan hype, whatever you want to call it. And it kind of seems like as time's gone on, the broader punk community has kind of closed ranks a little bit. It's a different story with nu metal. I think it's definitely changing, but nu metal is still a dirty word. And I think the dynamic is a little bit different. Let's be nerds and break down some nomenclature here.
Get those nerds! 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 What?
Pop punk is actually what it purports to be. It's a popularization of punk. Simple enough, right?
Tell me what have you got would make things so complicated.
By similar logic, nu metal is a newer version of heavy metal. Pop punk bands weren't competing with their more authentic counterparts. It's not like Newfound Glory headlining a Warped Tour took a spot away from the Unseen doing the same thing. However, Limp Bizkit being on the main stage for Ozfest 98, that's a little different. From their respective inceptions, metal has always been much more commercially viable than punk. Nu metal threatened to unseat traditional metal. Beyond that, the popularity of nu metal actually caused bands to alter their presentation. Kind of similar to hair metal bands releasing grunge albums in the mid-90s. Some of the legacy metal bands really tried their hands at some slight nu metal flavor, only to completely reject it a couple years later when the style had fallen out of fashion. Hey, I kind of get the resentment, but what if the opposite would have happened? What if in like 2003 the Casualties released a Good Charlotte style album? Wouldn't that have been awesome? What subgenre had the larger lasting musical impact? In recent years, elements of both pop punk and nu metal have reemerged within popular music. But I think they've manifested in different ways. When 2000s pop punk appears in modern music, the artists seem to be replicating pop punk. They're kind of jumping in a time machine and going back to 2002. On the metal side, it's a little more subtle. And I'm not the first to make this observation, but despite all the flack that nu metal takes, the music itself has been highly influential on modern metal. Like I pointed out earlier, it was an innovative genre, and some of those innovations, they stuck. From a purely musical standpoint, much more has been borrowed from nu metal than pop punk. The influence of pop punk nowadays, it's more of a spiritual one. Nu metal, it's more tangible. I was originally going to evaluate the cultural impact of both genres, but after thinking about it a little, I realized that it'd be difficult to break down and I would probably be repeating myself on several points. But on this topic, I do feel that pop punk was more embedded into the pop culture of the day. But if you scan current pop culture, there's probably more traces of nu metal. So it's a bit of a wash. And that's my attempt to arbitrarily compare pop punk and nu metal. Ultimately, I'm glad to see that these genres have not been lost to history. They may be the butt of jokes, but they haven't been completely forgotten. And those who saw these trends keep the memory alive through nostalgia, while a new generation puts their old spin on a newer concept. How do you think pop punk and nu metal compare? Sound off down below in the comment sections, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Talk to you next time.